Welcome, everybody, to yet another RPC podcast. We're doing a Bible study through the book of Matthew. We spent the last 3 weeks covering, first and foremost, how to do a background. And we went through the genealogy as Matthew gave the background context leading up to Jesus' birth. And we also looked into the background of a lot of the characters leading into Jesus' life and why Matthew writes the book the way that he does and includes the things that he includes. And then we spent a week talking through observations and learning how to look at a passage and try to find things that we normally wouldn't see by forcing ourselves to keep looking and increasing that number of observations. And then last week, we had gone through interpretation and application and closed out chapter 1. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. And instead of doing Bible study in front of you, we've all reviewed the passage, and even before starting this recording, had started comparing notes about how many observations we've made and which verses were more difficult than the others. And so there's some of that that's already gone on behind the scenes, but we have come prepared to this study and we're ready to discuss it. So let's get started with Matthew chapter 2. We'll see how far we get. I know that we've all done a good chunk of the way into this chapter. So let's get started. Who wants to read the passage for us? And let's start with just the first 12 verses.
I'll read the first 12 verses. Okay. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way.
All right. So to open up with this, we want to begin with the background section. Let's get some context of understanding. First off, where did Matthew start in chapter 1?
Do you mean where did he start in the genealogy?
Not necessarily in the genealogy. I'm just asking generally. Matthew chapter 1, he begins with a genealogy, so that's part of where he started. Where does he go to after that?
Before the birth of Jesus. So this is when the angel comes to Mary and Joseph and tells them that they're going to have a child. So right after she's pregnant, this is where it starts.
Okay. So we start in chapter 1, we see the prelude to Jesus' birth, but we don't actually see him born, right? Mm-hmm. And then now we get to Matthew chapter 2, and temporally, when does this seem to take place in the narrative relative to 1?
This is at some point after Jesus has been born.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you guys for a clear and obvious observation right there, and this is going to be an absence.
It does not say exactly when Jesus was born.
Right. Yeah, I'd say the key thing there is it's interesting that Matthew includes before and after Jesus' birth, but he excludes the actual birth itself, which I feel like other Gospels go into a little bit more. I believe Luke might be the main one. That being said, so taking, I guess, where is Matthew going with next in the narrative after these 12 verses that we just wrote?
It's basically describing where Jesus and his family went. in response to Herod. So it's like, where did they travel? Where did they go? So they went to Egypt. And then all of that happens, and then they come back to Nazareth, not Judea. So it's just traveling of Jesus and his family as a child.
Right. So we see a lot of stuff about the early Jesus's infancy, like his early childhood, that's being laid out in chapter 2. And then where does chapter 3 pick up?
John the Baptist.
Right. And how old is John the Baptist compared to Jesus? Does anybody know?
He was he 6 months older?
Yeah, 6 months.
Yep. So he's slightly older, but his mother and Mary were pregnant at the same time. And so we know that if John the Baptist is out preaching in chapter 3, we're jumping forward many years at that point, right?
Yeah.
So Matthew 1 and 2 create somewhat of a coupling. He's saying, let me go into all this background information before I begin the story so that you can see the circumstances leading into the Messiah doing what he's going to do.
Yeah, so then like in a TV show, you would then have a title screen fade over 30 years later, Matthew 3.
That's about right. So we've got that background on this. Tell me a little bit of background on Bethlehem and Judea.
So one of the interesting things about this narrative, especially when you couple it with Luke and the fact that Jesus does get consecrated in Jerusalem, is that Bethlehem is only a few kilometers away from Jerusalem. So when the wise men go to Jerusalem, as we'll see, and they speak to Herod, all this stuff is happening only a few kilometers away from where Jesus has already been born.
Yep.
It's also in Judea, which is the land of the clan of Judah, from which the promised king will come.
Is it just a clan at this point in the narrative?
No, this is an entire nation.
Right. So at some point, we see in the Kings and Chronicles that Israel, after David dies, ends up splitting. Right. So you get through David, Solomon, and then there's all these other kings where Israel and Judah basically part ways. And there's one king who is, I don't think he's from David's line, who tries to take over as, don't quote me on that. He might be from David's line. I just can't recall off the top of my head, who takes over as king of Israel. And then the tribe of Judah says, no, we have the true king because we follow the Davidic line. We follow through David and Solomon and so on. And so they try to become their own nation. Both of them go cockeyed. Neither of them really follow God fully. Judah has a few more acceptable kings than Israel did. But on the whole, they're separate nations, very split apart. And in the end, here we are in Judea, which is part of Judah. And Bethlehem is a small town within that. Somebody tell me about who Herod is at this point.
Well, Herod was the Roman appointed king. I believe he was appointed in 39 BC, and he would rule until 1 BC. And he was, appointed by the Romans, but he was a particularly cruel and tyrannical king, very bloodthirsty. He actually executed 2 of his sons who were favorites in Jerusalem just 2 years before the birth of Jesus. And his eldest son, Antipater, who would eventually go on to succeed him, was also under trial. So he was a king particularly concerned about succession.
Which is a little ironic because what happened to his kingdom after his rule?
It got split apart into 4 different pieces, I guess.
Right.
So then it's like the tetrarchy or whatever it's called.
Yep. So who is the Herod at the time of Jesus's death? You know, when we go to the crucifixion and all of that, and we see Jesus being handed over from Pilate to Herod, and you get that really cool song from Jesus Christ Superstar that I made Aaron listen to when he was over. Which Herod is that?
That would be Herod Antipas.
Right. And Herod Antipas was the one who ruled over Galilee. There was also Herod Archelaus, I don't know, ruling Judea and Samaria. So you have Judea and Samaria in one hand, Galilee in the other. And then there were, of course, two others who took over the split kingdom. But it's important to recognize that we're dealing with a different Herod whose reign is about to come to an end right at the time, just shortly after this story. So here we're talking about specifically in these first 12 verses, the story of the wise men. And Tom, can you pull up the other book that goes through the story of the wise men and read that for us so that we can get a parallel passage here?
Yeah, you have to give me a moment. I just have to throw open Bible Gateway, you know.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
What was the question again?
To pull up the parallel passage where that talks about the wise men and the star from the other gospel that addresses it.
Yeah, I can try to see if there's something.
Oh, you guys are all failing on your background section here.
Here is Matthew 2, Matthew chapter 2.
That's what we're studying right now.
Oh,
Where's
yes.
the parallel one?
Completely failing over here.
I'll give you a hint. We're going to be in silence for a long time.
Oh. Is this the only reference to the Magi?
There is no other reference. Matthew is the only book that talks about the wise men. And so let me throw this question out there too, because this is something interesting. How many wise men were there?
Oh, it doesn't say.
Doesn't say.
Right. We
3.
always in story assume that it's 3. The Bible doesn't actually tell us how many there were. Why do we assume that it's 3?
3 is the
1
magic
per
number.
gift.
What's that?
Said 1 per gift.
Right.
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So it's like, yeah.
So it does seem like it's implying 3, but 3 is just a nice number, isn't it? We always like to think in terms of 3s. The gifts come in 3s. You think, oh, the wise men will come in 3s. But yeah, there's no reference to the actual number of wise men.
Right. In Eastern traditions of Christianity, actually, I assume that there were 12 wise men who collectively brought the 3 gifts. And that there may have been other gifts involved. We don't know, but these are the ones that were mentioned specifically. And why are these gifts in particular mentioned? And let's, I guess, go ahead and name the gifts first.
Frankincense.
Gold.
Okay. And so why are these gifts in particular referenced in Matthew?
I should look that one up. I did hear a long time ago that myrrh was to represent something to do with a funeral. Is that correct? Like the perfumes for the anointing of a body that's going to be buried. I might be radically misremembering that though.
So there's a reference to Isaiah 60. And so Isaiah 66 says, "A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news and praises of the Lord."
There you go. What's Matthew's goal in writing his book? One of his goals, I should say, but one of the primary ones that we see recurring repeatedly.
Fulfilling the old.
Right, fulfilling Old Testament prophecy to prove that Jesus really is the Messiah referenced in Old Testament scripture. And so here we see that Matthew is clearly emphasizing, we don't know that there may have been other gifts, but we know at least of these ones, and Matthew sees fit to mention them because, hey, just so you guys know that this prophecy was fulfilled, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this is kind of some background on looking at, okay, well, we've got this story of the wise men, the Bethlehem star, and I guess you guys, are you aware of the prophecy regarding the star?
No.
So I found this one a little strange, but some people try to push this, and it's called the star prophecy. I think it's Numbers 24:17. Let me look that up real fast. And In the ESV, it says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. And so some people have, and not just some, I would say a lot of people have connected the star that shall come out of Jacob as being a reference to the star that was going to shine over Jesus. Now, to some degree, it looks to me like the star would be Jesus himself, not a physical star hovering over any particular location, but that is how many people have interpreted it and have tried to connect Numbers 24:17 to this particular star.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that background being said, let's dive into the text itself. Who wants to take verse 1 for us? And what I would like to do is each of us just kind of go round table, and actually let's just do it in alphabetical order. And we'll each take a verse at a time, and we'll share what we know from the verse or what we've discovered through our independent reading or study.
Aaron has got the most alphabetical name ever. So,
Yeah, you can't get better than that.
yeah, I always used to be the first on the register at school because of my last name. But yeah, double A for Aaron.
So we'll let Aaron go first. Aaron, you can go ahead and share some of the thoughts you had on verse 1 here. And then after you're done, we'll open the floor for anybody else to supplement what you may not have said. This is not an opportunity to say, let me read through all 20 of my observations on this verse, because that would make this Bible study take forever. So we're not going to do that. Instead, just give us the overview of things that you've noticed that you found to be most significant. And if there is something massively significant that somebody else realizes, then we can go ahead and weigh in afterward.
Great. Okay, so with this verse, what I noticed is all the places. So it specifically mentions Bethlehem, Judea, Jerusalem as physical places. And then also from the east, that's non-specific. So it's listing all these specific places. So like exactly in Bethlehem of Judea. And then wise men from the east. It doesn't say where from the east. It's just saying from the east somewhere. They're coming to a specific place. So I'm seeing this as location is important. And then this is all taking place after Jesus was born. So continuing the narrative of before Jesus' birth and what happened with that. This is after Jesus has been born, what happened. This is happening at a specific time period. So like there's a lot of time words. So now and after and in the days of. So another thing that's important is time. So place and time are both important, and Matthew is drawing focus to this. And then Herod the king. So Herod is mentioned as the king specifically, and that's mentioned a few other times in the upcoming verses. So you have one of the, I guess, characters here. So there's Jesus, there's Herod, there's wise men that are all characters starting in Matthew 2. And that continues on for basically the entire chapter. So Matthew is basically setting up like all of the different key places and people and times in this first verse. And I think that was the majority of what I noticed, other than so the wise men themselves, like what are wise men? Why are they from the east? What's important about the east? Where specifically in the east? So a lot of questions associated with that, and like why, what's the deal with wise men? Why isn't it like a Jewish prophet or something like that? So it seems a little bit obscure, and yeah.
State that question again.
What's the importance of wise men? Why are they from the east? Where is the east? And why wouldn't it be like a prophet from Israel that comes and gives this information?
So on the question of who are the wise men specifically, what do we know about them?
We know, well, first of all, we know that they were wise, but we also know that they were looking at the stars. And so in some church tradition, they've been called Persian astronomers.
Yeah, I would if they're looking at stars, I would assume they're astrologers. So like they specifically read meanings from the stars. And I know Babylon did a lot of that of astrology. Persia, not sure. I haven't looked into that. But in Daniel, I know it mentions that there were court astrologers and court magicians and all of these different people. So that somewhat tracks. But again, it doesn't say specifically in this verse.
So, have you ever all heard the Christmas song, We Three Kings of Or, right?
Yep.
Why are they called kings?
Well, one thing that's kind of extra textual at this point, because it's going to be talked about in the later verses, is that they're coming to do this proskuneo, this veneration. In the ESV, it's translated as worship, but the Greek is actually broader than that. It can just mean like the respect you pay to a ruler. It feels like a royal procession. It feels like a delegation of kings coming to pay homage to the king of this nation.
Okay.
They have treasures and they offer gifts.
Right. So what was I think somebody had made a reference earlier to Isaiah 60, right? What was that in reference to?
So the Queen of Sheba or something in there. Let me pull it up.
Oh, that's right. The gold and incense,
frankincense.
Right?
Yep.
So, and let me see if I can find what verse that was real fast.
There's Isaiah
verse
66. Yeah.
Right. If you go back a little bit to verse 3, Isaiah 63 says, and nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. And so there's a lot of references in this section to this bright star, and they mentioned twice that they saw it rising. And so we have these people who it says, the nations shall come to your light. It doesn't say what nations. It could very easily be nations from the east, right, who are coming to the light over him. And it's mentioned, it calls them kings to the brightness of your rising, right? So it's possible that they're the ones who were giving the gifts. And so some people have interpreted that prophecy to mean that these three wise men must have been kings. We don't know for sure that that's the case. In fact, I would wager that they were probably not actually kings. Otherwise, we might see Herod treating them a little bit differently, but you never know. And in fact, the word king oftentimes was not just over entire empires, but it could even be somebody who was a king over a local clan. So they might have been rulers within their own limited locality that could be dubbed kings. So there's a little bit of stretching that can be done there, but that was one of those things that I had found interesting when looking into the history of the wise men themselves, is that some people thought they were kings, and that's where we get the popular song from, even though there's no actual indication that they were, other than this vague allusion in Isaiah 60, verse 3.
Right.
I think Psalm 72:11 I have also mentions, may all kings fall down before him. And some people, I know Wikipedia, for example, has a line referencing that as, oh, that might be another reference to them being kings, although it's extremely thin.
Yeah, I think one of the things Aaron said was really great, that there's not much said about them and there's not much we can glean from them. And Matthew didn't think it was that important, ultimately. Didn't think it was that important to tell us more.
Why not?
Possibly because their identity could have been anyone. It wouldn't have made a difference to what they were doing. The information we do have, that they were wise, that they were from the east and foreign. It says in verse 12, I think, that they went back to their own nation, so outside of Israel, not just the east of Israel, that they were foreign wise men who came to proskuneo, to worship or venerate this king of the Jews. Well, ultimately, I think what it gets back to is that Jesus is going to be recognized by the nations and not just by those in his own nation.
Right. Or the short answer is simply, because their identity isn't relevant to the fulfillment of prophecy, only that they were there and that they gave gold and frankincense.
Yeah. So in other words, we don't really need to do too much digging.
Correct.
It's interesting, but it's not that important.
Yeah, he's vague for a reason, and he's specific for a reason when he says Bethlehem, Judea, Jerusalem. This is exactly where Jesus was born. This is when he was born. This is who is reigning. So he's drawing attention to what is important and then making vague or obscuring what's not that important.
Right. All right, so moving on to verse 2. And I'll take that one because I think I'm next in alphabetical lineage. And goodness, this is one that I had the most observations on. So they came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." All right, now this is fascinating, that this concept of them calling him the King of the Jews. I did a little research on this and found that nowhere in all of Scripture does a God-believing person or Christian or anybody who's a follower of Jesus or Yahweh ever call Jesus King of the Jews. It is only ever Gentiles and non-believers who call him this. In this situation, the wise men, even though they are obviously coming to worship Jesus and may have believed in the prophecy, are still Gentiles. They're not of the Jewish people. And instead, if you look in the book of Mark, it's Mark 15:32, I believe, where the Jewish leaders actually call him the King of Israel instead. And Mark actually has 5 references to King of the Jews in that chapter alone that are all used by Gentiles. And the one time he has a Jewish leader speaking, it's King of Israel. So I think it's interesting that it seems like Mark is trying to make a specific point out of the title that's given and how the Jews versus the Gentiles viewed this title differently. So these wise men are coming, not necessarily from a standpoint of Israel, but looking at Jesus as the King of the Jews. They say, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" emphasizing the fact that Jesus was in fact born. He did not descend from heaven the way that he eventually ascended back, but he had a birth, he had a death, and eventually an ascension. But there was never a descending, which is fascinating. Although it sounds like if you take a futurist view of Revelation, he may eventually descend for that purpose. So, "For we saw his star when it rose." Again, the star, we've already referenced some history there, so I'm not going to dive into that again. When it rose, they'll mention it rising again. But the idea that they saw it when it rose means that it already rose at one point. And so the implication I get here, and this is one of the questions that I have off of verse 2, is do you get the implication that the star rose and then it's gone and they're looking for where it was? And then it later reappears in a later verse? Or do you get the impression here that the star has been lingering around for quite a long time?
This is one of the things that confused me, actually. So they go to Jerusalem from wherever they came from in the east. They didn't go directly to Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is very close to Jerusalem, so they get almost all the way there. But then they have to go around asking, where is the Christ? Where is he to be born? And they only find out when Herod tells them. Herod finds out from the chief priests and scribes, and then he summons in a secret meeting the wise men, tells them to go to Bethlehem, search diligently for the Christ, and then they go to Bethlehem. But the star actually leads them all the way to the house. And how the star does that exactly, I've no idea. It seems to imply that the star was actually hovering over the house in some discernible way, which is miraculous.
Right, we'll get there too.
yeah, of course, jumping ahead of things here. But yeah, that seems to be the sense, is that the star was either disappeared or ended up changing its behavior in some way. And I don't know if you want to allow me to jump to one of the verses where they head off there. Let's see, where is it? It's verse 10. It says, "When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy." So that was, they followed the star to the house where the child was, and then when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, which seems to be that they responded to the star itself. So the star was doing something different.
Yeah. So 2 more things to note out of verse 2 here. The first one is that the reference to the star is possessive. for we saw his star. So they know that this star is of significance to a specific person. It's not just, oh, we saw this crazy star and decided to follow it, right? They knew what they were looking for. And this is even more evident, and that's the second thing, is when they arrive in Jerusalem, they ask, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? As if they already know what the prophecies were saying, right? So there's this implication that they know what the prophecies are about the king of the Jews, and they're looking for the fulfillment of that prophecy, which gets really bizarre when we get a little bit later, and they start asking, and it's clear that Herod has to go to the chief priests and the scribes in order to get the answer, because even though these wise men knew about the prophecy, they didn't know enough about it. So that's kind of fascinating. But either way, that's all I got on verse 2. Joseph, you want to take verse 3 for us?
Would you mind if I just add one more detail to verse 2, which I think was
Sure.
really interesting? It's that they ask not where is the king of the Jews, but where is he who has been born king of the Jews? This is someone who was actually born into the kingship, not someone who acquires it.
Right.
I find that detail also really fascinating.
Yeah, I
For
have that
one-
as well, that it's a title that's acquired by birthright, not a title that's acquired by assuming it for from your own ambition.
So one interesting thing in addition or question is astrology real? So in like another interpretation of how they're obtaining this knowledge is like they do astrology, right? And they have whatever meanings are associated with stars and these kinds of things. And so they independently are like, oh, the king of the Jews is associated with this star and it appears. So let's go like check that out. Versus them knowing all of these Jewish prophecies and then starting to go to that. So it's like some weird independent verification that this is happening. Like even in the pagan world, they're noticing, oh, the king of the Jews is being born. Let's go worship.
And I guess I should ask off of that is, do we really know that they are astrologers, or do we just assume that because they're looking up at the stars and decide to follow a star, that therefore they must be astrologers?
That would be an assumption. They're wise men, they're from the east, and they're pulling meaning from the stars.
Right. And in fact, if we look a little bit later, and I know we're jumping all over the place a little bit here, but when we see the star rise again and they decide to follow it, it moves ahead of them and they're following this star, and it lands over the house where Jesus is staying, right? Which tells me, I mean, if no matter how big a star is up in the sky,
Yeah.
I mean, I can think of whether the North Star or the times that I've looked at Jupiter that looked like a star, and it was bright up there. I mean, you could tell it was the brightest star in the sky at the time.
Yep.
And could you look up in the sky, even with how bright, imagine the star was even 10 times brighter, and think, oh, well, that's sitting over that house right there.
I doubt it.
No.
Yeah,
So it tells me that whatever star they were seeing was really
Something else.
so low to the ground and separate from all of the other stars that it was is not really an astrological phenomenon. It tells me that it's more just a shining light that was guiding them, that the best description they could have for it was that it's a star.
Gotcha.
Probably the better translation for these guys then is not so much the wise men as the, well, it was pretty common sense when you look back at it, men.
Yes. Because I have to imagine that even if they were not astrologers, that they probably would have been shocked to see this low-hanging light that is hovering over houses. So anyway, all of that aside, Joseph, why don't you take verse 3 for us?
Actually, Tom, you go ahead. I was on holidays last week, so I didn't get this assignment, but I'll chime in where I have insight.
I got you.
Okay, sure thing. So let's see here. So this is about Herod hearing about about what the wise men have come to Jerusalem to say, and him being troubled, and Jerusalem being troubled with him. So we have this intimation that Herod isn't getting it directly from the wise men. It's actually that the wise men have gone to Jerusalem and they're asking people, who they're asking we don't know, but the rumor is spreading that there's this group of men, this group of wise men who have shown up and they are looking for the Christ. They followed a miraculous star to Jerusalem, and they want to know where the Christ, the King of the Jews, has been born. And they're actually looking for a child who has been born. So that's one thing. So Herod's heard not just that the King of the Jews has been born, but that the wise men have shown up in order to pay proskuneo to him. They want to worship him. They want to revere him. And we know from some extra textual background history, as I mentioned earlier, that Herod was a cruel, sadistic man who had just killed two of his.
Uh-oh, I think we lost Tom.
Sounds like it.
All right, anybody else want to chime in on something interesting you noticed from verse 3? I guess I'll do so. I find it fascinating. It says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Why would Jerusalem be troubled about the King of the Jews being born? You would think that Jerusalem would be excited for the King of the Jews, right? Or, Herod might have reason to be concerned or upset because his status of power is in jeopardy if this, warrior king that the Jews expected the Messiah to be is finally being born. So why in the world would Jerusalem be troubled alongside Herod?
Maybe. So one possibility is Herod overreacts, and if there is, based on what Tom said, he killed his two sons. And so if there is somebody who is vying for power, that's going to cause, social unrest or something like that?
Yeah, that very well could be. And it makes you wonder how many of the Jews in Jerusalem didn't actually believe the Messiah was a real person who would come, right? Because oh my goodness, this person who's being claimed to be the King of the Jews is now being born, and this is going to cause all kinds of unrest, but we know it can't be for real, right? And it's just like all those people out there in the world today who claim to be Christians, and yet the idea of Jesus actually returning or expecting anything from them is just this, oh my goodness, somebody's just going to cause a problem for our lives, right? And so there's a sense that I get where there's all these Jews who may not even have really believed what their own historical religion had said, and they'd maybe moved on during their time in captivity and thought, that was all the stuff that our forefathers believed. We don't really believe that anymore. Much the same way that I would imagine the modern nation of Israel really is not oriented around the Old Testament laws and the scriptures the same way that you would think when you see a lot of what Jesus' ministry with the Jews looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to get off and hop right back on, and we're going to try to fly through the rest of the 12 verses.
Okay. Sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right, go ahead, Tom.
Okay, so we had a little internet outage and we're carrying on. So the only other thing I wanted to add to verse 3 is that there is an absence point to make here, which is that God did not withhold from Jesus being born in a very evil period under a king who was willing to kill 2-year-olds in an attempt to kill Jesus. He didn't put him in the kingdom of a king who was religiously expecting and hopefully waiting for the Messiah.
Yep. So, Aaron, you want to take verse 4 for us?
Sure. Okay, so Herod, doesn't know when or...
Can you read the verse first?
Oh, yeah. 4 is, and assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. Okay, so main point of this is Herod doesn't know where the Christ is to be born. 2, that he is conflating what the wise men said about he who has been born King of the Jews with the Christ. So they didn't mention the Christ, but somehow those two ideas are connected. being a king and being the Christ. And he went and sought after the chief priests and scribes where the Christ was to be born.
So who are the chief priests and the scribes?
Basically the scholars. So like the chief priests are the ones that the scribes are the scholars. They like study the scriptures and know a whole lot.
And they were the ones who literally wrote it down and made sure the written law was preserved.
Right. So if anybody is going to have seen Bethlehem or something said about where the Christ was to be born, it would have been them.
Right.
And the chief priests are the ones, I assume, primarily responsible with facilitating sacrifices and upkeep of the temple and dealing with that. But I'm sure they are also well versed in scriptures.
Right. So carrying from there into verse 5, they told him in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And so the they is obviously referencing the chief priests and scribes answering Herod's question. It's not surprising, as much as they knew the scriptures, that they had the answer right on the tip of their tongues. It's going to be in Bethlehem of Judea, which is interesting that they don't just reference it as Bethlehem. It's in both verse 1 and here, Bethlehem of Judea, trying to give some emphasis to that from Matthew. For so it is written by the prophet, telling us, okay, well, we've got a prophet here who's speaking something. They identify him as the prophet, but they don't say the prophet by name, which is bizarre. And what's even more bizarre to me is that I believe the prophet referenced in this chapter is Micah, but when they used the same phrase, the prophet, in chapter 1 without identifying the prophet, it was Isaiah. So you can't just assume that because they say the prophet that, it's got to be Isaiah, because Isaiah is the main prophet who talks about the coming of Jesus. No, so we have two different prophets now who are referenced as the prophet. So it's just a general phrase for really anybody who has a prophecy relevant to the question at hand.
Another interesting point there is when Matthew references the prophet earlier, it quotes from two different prophets. So it quotes Malachi and Isaiah, and it says the prophet.
Oh, fascinating. I didn't pick up on that earlier.
No, maybe it's later. It's about John the Baptist. I can't remember where it is, but...
Okay. So not our chapter 1 section, but apparently the phrase the prophet will show up again soon.
Anyways, continue.
So actually, I think that's all I got on verse 5. Verse 6, I want to do something a little unusual here. Does anybody know the reference that this is coming from?
Yeah, Micah 5:2.
All right.
So I think the unusual thing you're going to guess towards here is that it's a paraphrase. This is not an exact quotation.
Not even that. Let's
read it.
Well, I want two of you guys to read this simultaneously, right? Just to see how closely these go. So, Aaron or Joseph, do you want to read the Matthew version? And Aaron, if you can read the Micah 5:2 version, and try to read them at the same time. Both of you use the ESV if you can, and let's see how well these line up.
Okay.
All right. Let me pull the ESV actually. One sec. Okay, I've got it pulled up. Read at the same time.
Yeah.
All right, starting 3, 2, 1. But you,
and you, O
Bethlehem,
and
Ephrathah,
Judah,
who are too little to be among the
by
clans
no
of
means
Judah,
least among
from
the
you shall
rulers
come
of
forth
Judah.
for me,
For
one
from you
who
shall
is to
come
be
a
ruler in
who
Israel,
will shepherd my people
whose
Israel.
coming forth is from of old, from ancient days.
Do these all sound alike?
Nah.
And I know that we're reading an Old Testament was from Hebrew and a New Testament was from the Greek, but you would think that the translators, knowing that these two verses were meant to mean the same thing, or were they, I would try to find some more opportunity to interpret them or translate them to be consistent with one another, yet they don't even try. And why do you think that is?
they were very loose with their Old Testament understanding. Or rather, they picked out all the relevant parts and just kind of like skipped over the things that didn't matter, although it doesn't negatively affect the interpretation.
I can't agree with that, because in Micah 5, the prophecy given there actually is stronger for the divine and messianic origin of Jesus. It says that, Joseph, you have it in front of you. The one who is eternal, comes from eternity, the ancient one.
Yeah, from of old, from ancient
From
days.
of old, yeah. So you'd think Matthew would actually be at pains to quote the exact correct Micah 1.
Say that again?
You would think that Matthew, who's trying to show that Jesus fulfills prophecies, is going to quote that last part, which he leaves out from Micah, which is that Jesus is this ancient one.
So let's look at a couple of the distinctions between the two passages. So the first one, Matthew starts "and you," whereas Micah starts "but you." Why would they change it from a "but" to an "and"?
I'm pretty sure they're the same word, but it depends on what's coming before. So like perhaps in verse 1 of Micah, there's something going on, and then the "but" is just contrasting that in a negative or an opposite way what came before. Whereas in Matthew, the "and" is, I don't know, just there.
I wonder what the Septuagint actually says in Micah 5:2. Does anybody happen to have that handy?
So I'm gonna go ahead and say there's a gar, so GAR or gamma alpha, whatever it's called, and that word means both for or and but, or it can mean both.
So in the Septuagint, Micah 5:2 starts out with Kai, Kai.
Okay, so that's and.
Kappa, alpha.
Yep.
And
so that just means and. That is not. Wait, no, that can mean both. Sorry, gar is for. My bad. Mistake. But yeah, Kai can mean both.
Okay, interesting. Well, I learned something there. I do know that the connection, if you look in Micah 5:2, it starts off with about troops being mobilized and siege is laid against us. With a rod, they will strike the cheek of the judge of Israel. And so there's this draw of attention to war. And, the "but" kind of contrasts that. And some of me makes me wonder if maybe by having it translated with the "but," if they were to start their quotation to Herod with a "but," he's going to say, well, hold on, but what? And they don't want to draw his attention to any war. And so there's a good chance they say, well, it could also be interpreted as "and." So we're just going to say, "and you, O Bethlehem," just kind of like, oh, we're just quoting in the middle of a passage here. You don't need to know what comes before that, Herod. Some of that
is it's Bethlehem right here.
Right. So they both say, "Oh, Bethlehem," or Bethlehem. In Micah, it says Ephrathah, whereas in Matthew, it says "in the land of Judah," and then "are by no means least among the rulers of Judah." So read that again, "and are by no means least among the rulers of Judah." You're not the least. Whereas Micah is saying, "who are too little to be among the clans of Judah." Right? It's saying you are basically the least. Why do you think that they're flipping this?
I don't know the exact reason that you're driving at, but why they would flip that. But I didn't even consider that they. So I said earlier that Matthew would be at pains to state that thing about the ancient one, but I see now that this isn't Matthew per se. This is Matthew quoting the chief priests and scribes speaking to a tyrannical king.
Right. So Matthew's not quoting the prophet for his own purpose to say, look, here's a prophecy Jesus fulfilled. He's saying, no, this is what they told to Herod about the prophecy. And he uses an exact quotation from them. Even though any good Jew who looked into this prophecy they could pull up their scriptures, or they would take it to somebody, and they would be able to look at this and say, that's not what that says.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great point. I didn't even consider that. And so, I was confused why he had. I could get a paraphrase earlier. That's what I thought was going on here. I thought he was just gesturing towards it, speaking a bit loosely because the readers would understand, or something like that. But yeah, actually, that's a pretty good explanation. So why does he flip that second line?
Do you think Herod would have felt very good about this Bethlehem town that's supposed to be significant? And in his eyes, he's thinking, oh, some Messiah is supposed to be born from Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is part of my kingdom. Do you think that Herod would have enjoyed hearing, oh, it's only a small village among all the people of Judah, too little to be among the clans of Judah? And so instead, it to some degree, I wonder, and I'm just speculating here, I obviously don't know for sure, but I wonder if the chief priests and scribes weren't buttering up to Herod here and saying, oh, you're by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, right? Trying to make it look like this town in Herod's kingdom isn't some feeble podunk nothing, which it really was.
That seems like a very plausible interpretation.
Because we know from Old Testament passage time and again, these advisors to the kings, especially the secular kings, were willing to tell them whatever they wanted to hear to keep them happy. And I could very easily see these chief priests and scribes being willing to compromise how they quote the scriptures to Herod in order to appease him and keep him happy too.
Yeah, I mean, you contrast that with the other Herod and John the Baptist, right? And he's beheaded because he's not willing to do this.
Right. And then there's another interesting where Matthew says, for from you shall come a ruler, whereas Micah says, from you shall come forth for me. That for me is distinctly absent. One who is to be ruler in Israel, right? So then you have who will shepherd my people Israel. I don't even know where that came from. Whereas Micah says, who's coming forth is from of old, from ancient days.
Oh, you know what? There's in Micah 5:4, it says, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord.
Ah.
The majesty of the name of the Lord is God. So it shows up a little bit later.
Okay. So they truncated it.
Yeah.
But they did drop that very significant, who's coming forth is from of old, from ancient days.
Yeah. So it's all fascinating to me. And like I say, we're not going to know for sure why these chief priests and scribes were misquoting scripture to Herod, or if it's just a summary of, here they told him this just off the top of their heads rather than quoting it. But the reality is the chief priests and scribes were required to memorize every word of scripture. And in fact, they had to know it so well that, if I recall correctly, from studying about how they were discipled and what they were trained to do, is in order to ensure the accuracy of the scriptures that the scribes were writing, they had to be able to take a number that was random, and they would say like 5,326, and they would have to be able to point to the character that was written that far in and make sure that it matched up. So that way they could do random spot tests. And they were required to memorize every single word and letter of the scriptures, front to back, Genesis to Malachi, word perfect, and to be able to say it backwards, which it just baffles me. I mean, I have like the book of Philippians memorized, but no way I could say it backwards. But that's how well these chief priests and scribes were intended to know the scriptures, and were studying to be able to do it that thoroughly. And so for them to make a mistake by speaking off the cuff seems implausible to me. But why exactly it's different, I'll leave that to our listeners to research and discern for themselves. Let's go on to verse 7.
Whose turn is it?
Let's go with yours.
Me? So verse 7 says, then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. So again, we go back to Aaron's earlier point that time is a significant factor here. We don't even know when the star first appeared, but the star has caught the attention of Herod. Now we've also got the fact that Herod summoned the wise men secretly. He didn't want to make a big show out of meeting with them. Now, why would that be? Well, possibly because of the growing turmoil around the news that they had brought with them and the fear of Herod, which, as we just saw, may well have even have penetrated into his chief priests and scribes. They were lying about what scripture said in order to keep this man calm, tell him what he wants to hear. So he summons them secretly, and that might also be part of his later plan, mightn't it, to kill the young children in Bethlehem. He didn't want people to know that he knew what was going on in Bethlehem, and so the wise men were going to become his spies. So he also ascertains from them what time the star had appeared. That means, I think, that he just asked them and they told him. So they were completely willing at this point and trusting to tell him what they knew. And they don't mistrust him. But I think the important part of this verse is the time issue. It's a very important part of the entire Christmas narrative, is that we're not entirely sure of the time period. We don't even know how long the wise men have been in Jerusalem.
Right. Any other thoughts or questions on verse 7?
It doesn't say that Herod asked any other information other than what time the star had appeared. So you could read that as, one, Matthew just leaves that out, or two, Herod doesn't care about any other information that they may have other than, okay, when did this appear?
And why did he care about the timing again?
Probably for age ranges.
Right.
Of children born, so yeah.
Okay. Does anybody want to take verse 8? We don't necessarily have to keep going in order.
I have not done observations for any of the rest of the verses, so
that's fine. And even if you and Joseph want to take a verse, even if you haven't done observations on it, you can still speak off the cuff.
Sure. Okay, so I'll read verse 8. And he said, and he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." So one thing I notice is Herod is tasking them, the wise men, with going and finding the child, and not any other individual or group of individuals. So like he doesn't send the chief priests and the scribes to go find them. He sends these wise men for whatever reason to do that.
And significantly, if he knows he's going to go try to kill this kid, wouldn't you send like some kind of Roman guard or legion out to go slaughter him?
Right.
But no, he's sending these strangers who he has no power or authority over and assuming that they'll just do his bidding. I mean, that's pretty narcissistic right there.
Right. Maybe it would be suspicious for him to send out Roman soldiers or his own soldiers or whatever to find the child.
Yeah, I don't think this is narcissism. I think it's cunning. I think he's lying about his intentions. He says that so I too may come and worship him. He's trying to trick these wise men into revealing the location of the child, which also ties in with the fact that he met with them secretly.
Right. And then one aspect of this that I can't remember if I mentioned before, but the wise men wanted to worship the king of the Jews, basically, which is interesting. So, like, I don't know if king worship was common back then, or in which places it was good to worship kings. I know you worshiped gods and stuff, but kings, not sure. And then for Herod to say, "I'm going to come worship him," that's also interesting.
So again, with this word worship, the Greek is proskuneo, which does have a broad range of meaning. It doesn't just mean the kind of worship you give up to gods. It could also mean that. It is used in that way, but it's also used in a more secular way too.
Okay, sure.
It's also interesting to me that he says to bring word of the child. when they find him, right? It doesn't say that they're to bring the child to him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fascinating to me as well, that, you would think that Herod say, oh, if you find him, have his family come on over, I'll host him at my palace and we can all have a good old party while I stab him to death. Right? So that I find interesting.
That's part of the secrecy, I think, is like, let me do everything at every step of the way. Let me be as secretive as possible. So like him going there, that's putting it in his court to go and do stuff versus bringing him to Jerusalem. There's going to be a lot of people seeing that and a lot of people, like a lot of press, basically. Whereas if he goes, he can like do whatever he wants.
Right. And now the other thing there's a couple things that I'm starting to think of too. One is, how does Matthew have any clue what happened in this conversation?
Oh, that's a good question.
I mean, I have to imagine maybe the wise men, when they arrived, told Mary the story, and Mary later on told Jesus and the apostles and all of that. So that's possible that the wise men explained to Mary what happened in this conversation, especially once they found out that, oh my goodness, Herod's probably going to try to kill him. Let's make sure that Mary and Joseph, although it was an angel who had to warn them to leave. But either way, that's one fascinating thing, is how do we know, how does Matthew know what's being said here at all?
Maybe I was going to say maybe some of the chief priests or scribes, it's known that some of them became Christians after Jesus ascended and they became disciples and stuff, or were part of the church. So maybe there were a couple of them that were in this little meeting with Herod.
That's fascinating too, although that wouldn't explain the knowledge of the secret meeting.
Yeah, no, it would be both. It would be like, okay, Matthew's pulling from multiple sources. So like, yeah, the wise men tell Mary, and then you have the other people telling, or the chief priests or the scribes or whoever, telling Matthew about the other aspect.
So the other thing here is that Herod assumes that they will have to search diligently for the child. And let's hop into verse 9. And how hard did they actually have to search? I mean, were they knocking on door after door? Is the Christ child here? Is the Christ child there?
Yeah, so the diligently comment, they had no idea where in Bethlehem the child was. There's this real element of lacking knowledge of where the star appeared, when it appeared, why it appeared, who the child is, where he is in Bethlehem, or where in fact he was, because he has to go to the chief priests. But then God, through the star, shows the wise men exactly, miraculously, which house he's in.
Going into verse 9, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose before them until it came to rest over, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. So we already talked about this a little bit, so I don't want to spend too much time on this verse, but it's fascinating that the way that he introduces this, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose the first time, the rising that was referenced in verse 2, it makes it look like the star was gone, and then all of a sudden it comes back. And this leads to another question that I had, which is, why did God want these wise men to show up at Jesus's home or birth or wherever he was staying at the time in his infancy? Why was that necessary? And we could say, oh, well, to fulfill the prophecy, obviously. But the prophecy is prophesying what would actually happen, right? God could have prophesied that nobody would come, right? So why is it significant that God's going to say, I got to make sure that these wise men get over there, and I'm going to give them this bright shining light to hover over this house so that they can find exactly where he's at?
A broader version of that question might be, why is the infancy of Jesus so important? It's only discussed in 2 Gospels, and then only briefly. It's, like you said, it's Matthew 1 and 2, and then there's that title screen 30 years later. We see so little of Jesus' infancy, the story of Jesus at the temple being another one. But why do the wise men go to pay respects to him when he's still a baby? I mean, it's quite interesting when we get to verse 11. not wanting to skip ahead, but when we do get to verse 11, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him, the child. They worshipped the child. He didn't even understand what was going on.
Or piggyback off of your question, why go when he's still a baby? But here we have these wise men who know that he's the king of the Jews. And the chief priests and the scribes, it says in verse 4, he inquired of them, he being Herod, inquired of them where the Christ was to be born, right? So the chief priests and scribes know that this guy is going to be the Messiah. And you've got these Herod who knows, and then you've got these wise men who know about the prophecy and know he's the Messiah. And yet we still see John the Baptist later on, and we'll get there in future weeks, I assume, but who is off saying, there he is. Let me point out to him. That's the one who's the Messiah that I've been, preparing you for. And it's just bizarre to me that if so many people knew from his very infancy that he was the Messiah, it's just so weird that they have to point him out and say, oh, that's the way, that's the guy. And a lot of people didn't even know it at the time. And they're even questioning, are you really the Messiah or not? So it's just a whole fascinating,
That is interesting. The piggyback off of that, we have multiple places in the Gospels where Jesus is ignored by the people he grew up with. I mean, we know that his brothers were not believers, but also he says that that prophets never respected in their homeland. And there's one part of, where was the verse? I can't remember. It's in Luke, I think, where Jesus reads part of Isaiah, and he stops mid-verse and says, I'm the fulfillment of that. And they tried to kill him. his own people tried to throw him off of a mountain. And then also in John 6, there is this moment where the people who he's miraculously fed with all these signs and said, hey, you're claiming to be the bread of life. Aren't you, didn't we grow up with you? Aren't you the son of Joseph and Mary? We know you. And yet he was clearly known.
Right. So who wants to take verse 10 for us? And we're going to fly through, we're running out of time here. So let's fly through these to get through 10, 11, and 12.
This one I only managed to get 6 observations for. This is when it really started to fall apart for me. I mean, this is such a short one. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. I mean, what can you say about this? They saw the star. I think what it's saying contextually is they saw the star over the house, because then the next verse immediately says conjunction and going into the house. But so they see the star, it's probably hovering over the house, and they rejoice exceedingly. So they see the terminus of their journey as something to be rejoicing over. The miracle of this star hanging over a house is something to rejoice about. And they don't just rejoice a small amount. They go like, hey, we're here. Great job, everyone. They rejoice exceedingly with great joy. It's great joy. So for whatever reason, these wise men from the East, I find it particularly joyous that they've discovered the King of the Jews.
Yep. So verse 11. Any takers?
I can take it, but I don't know if you want to do it.
Yeah, I'll grab 11. And going to the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, we've already referenced the gifts in the Old Testament as being something that was prophesied specifically. And so Matthew obviously wants to mention them. It does say opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, right? So there's treasures. We don't know if these were the only gifts or not. But it certainly is significant to Matthew to mention those ones in particular. Obviously, Mary is brought up here. It's interesting that they don't mention Joseph, even though we do know in the very next verse after these 12, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. So that's fascinating to me that Mary here specifically is the one who is identified as being with Jesus. Matthew clarifies, hey, it is his mother, because there are other Marys. So they fell down and worshiped him. Obviously, they know he's the Messiah. They recognize that this is significant. Although it's interesting to me that they do end up returning to their home areas rather than thinking, oh my goodness, we found the Messiah, let's stay. Like, but that's the next verse. So, but this idea that they fell down and worshiped him shows that they still do know the significance of who they're before.
Yes, so in the next verse, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. You're right, it's so immediate. It's like they see the child with his mother, they fall down and worship him, they give him treasures, and they leave apparently really quickly. But there is some stretch of time, some undisclosed, once again, never disclosed stretch of time because they're warned in a dream.
Right.
So I think this has to be at least one night because, as I said before, Bethlehem is right next to Jerusalem. So they have to have gone to sleep to be warned not to go back to Jerusalem because they could have walked back to Jerusalem that very day if they got there early enough. So that could have been a real disaster. So they stayed for at least a day, I think.
Right. So let me ask this now. Out of these first 12 verses, we have this miraculous story of God leading these wise men to Jesus. And as miraculous as all of this seems, and as much as they're quoting the scriptures and the prophet, and they're talking through the chief priests and the scribes, really there's conspicuously absent is any reference to God himself or the Holy Spirit, who could feasibly be interpreted as being the star that was guiding them, or even Jesus himself. His actual name is completely absent from all of this, even though we had been given his name in the previous chapter. The angel had told Joseph, you will call his name Jesus. And yet here we have this story that nobody's mentioning Jesus by name. And even Matthew, in going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. And I just think it's interesting how Matthew words this. But then with God being conspicuously absent, you go into verse 13, and immediately, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord. And right all of a sudden, now God's getting into the story. So we just got 3 minutes left here, but I want to ask, and I want to make sure it gets asked in every study that we do going forward, why are these 12 verses in the book of Matthew?
My answer would be emphasize. So based on how many time words, place words, people, characters, and stuff, this is emphasizing Jesus's incarnation, like into the actual world, and then saying this is like he's a real human being, and not like some sort of, God didn't just put a spirit inside of a corpse and then animate it or something. Like, no, he's a human being. And then it's the meeting of divinity and humanity together. And so right now he's emphasizing, hey, this is the physical or the human aspect of what is happening.
I absolutely agree. And especially with Matthew in particular, with the Magi being mentioned, is also the validation of the birth of Jesus and the importance that it had at that time. It could be one thing if Jesus was born, but it's another thing that the Magi's recognized who it was being born and the importance of what was happening.
I want to say that he was showing that Jesus' birth was fulfilling multiple prophecies, but also that he came in a politically significant time, that his birth was associated with the Roman occupation and the secular occupation of the Jewish homeland.
All right, I think those are some good answers. And obviously we have this whole section that is fulfilling prophecy that no other gospel references. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that depending on your version of dating, some people believe that most people believe Mark was the first of the gospels that was written, followed by Matthew. Some people would put John around the same time frame as Matthew, though probably still after. So at this time, Matthew would have only had Mark to look at, and even then it might have been a contemporary. He might not have had that book in circulation to be able to check in on it. But either way, we do know that Matthew's trying to establish the fulfillment of prophecy, And none of the other gospel writers saw fit to add this section. So it's kind of useful that he did have this in here for us to be able to point to all of those Old Testament things and affirm, yep, Jesus is really who he says he was. All right, that's all we got today. And next time we'll make sure to reserve time for application as well. But thanks for covering this, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys next week.